The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 7th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people." This word about him spread throughout all Judea and all the surrounding country. The Gospel of the Lord. When I was a real little kid, some of my earliest memories are from my grandparents' house on Long Beach Island in New Jersey. They had this little house that was two houses down from the sand dunes and the beach, and probably one of the reasons some of my earliest memories are from that house is because we would walk to the beach, we would go to the shore, we would fly kites on the dunes. It was a great experience. And another thing that I remember from my grandparents' house was that whenever we visited my grandparents, my grandmother always had this great big bowl of Hershey bars sitting on the kitchen table. And loving chocolate from a very early age, it was always great to know that there was always going to be that great big bowl of Hershey bars there whenever we went to Grandma's house, and I was going to get to eat the chocolate. So my grandparents sold that house when I was about 5 years old, and they moved out west and did all kinds of retirement things, but my grandmother lived on until I was in my mid-30s. And one of the great things about having your grandparents around and still being fully mentally competent and everything into your mid-30s is that you can talk to them about all kinds of stuff that went on in your childhood, and things like you can tell them how crazy your parents are because your grandparents will agree with you. They think their kids are nuts too. That's why grandparents and grandchildren are natural allies. But you can also manage to share some of your reflections and your remembrances about how great it was to be a little kid in your house. So sometime I was probably in my real early 30s, and I was visiting my grandmother, and I said, one of the things that I always remember and appreciated about going to your house when you had that house on Long Beach Island was that you always had that great big bowl of Hershey bars sitting there on the kitchen table. And my grandmother looked at me with this funny look, and she goes, "What?" And I said, yeah. You always had this great big bowl of Hershey bars, and I vividly remember it was Hershey bars. It wasn't just any kind of chocolate bar, it was Hershey bars, and they always sat there, and you said that you would put them in Pop-Pop's lunch, and you would let me have one, and it was always there. And she thought about that for a couple of minutes, and she went, "Well, I used to pass out Hershey bars for Halloween. So if you guys had come to the shore sometime right after Halloween, I would have had the bowl with the Hershey bars still sitting there on the table, and I'd have been trying to get rid of them. So yeah, it probably did happen that one time." It clearly made a big impression on me. And I said, "Yeah, I guess it must have. But I was right, it did happen. But it only happened once. It only happened that one time, but it made such an impression on me that in my mind, it was always like that. It always was like that whenever we went to Grandma's house." And when I read things in the Gospels, I sometimes have that same kind of impression, especially when I read things like today's Gospel reading, where Jesus raises somebody from the dead. I'm tempted to look at that story and go, well, of course Jesus raised somebody from the dead. Jesus was always doing that. That's what Jesus did. Jesus went around, he preached the gospel, he healed the sick, he raised people from the dead. We have songs where we sing that, where that's the thing that Jesus does. Jesus did it all the time. So you know how many times in Luke's gospel Jesus raised somebody from the dead? Twice. Actually twice. It is twice as often as Jesus did it in every other gospel reading. In Matthew's gospel, Mark's gospel, John's gospel, one time and one time only does Jesus raise somebody from the dead. And yet, even more so than a big bowl of Hershey bars, that makes a big impression on people. It makes a big impression on us when we read about it. And we figure, well, this must have been what Jesus always did. But Jesus didn't raise people from the dead all that often. It happened only rarely. And the gospel writers did not record it so that we could have this kind of Hershey bar experience where we think, well, Jesus always did that. Or so that we could kind of look back nostalgically on the old days and say, you know, wouldn't it have been great if we'd have been back in the days when Jesus was walking the earth, when Jesus just raised everybody. He just kind of walked around and said, okay, you're raised from the dead, you're raised from the dead, you're raised from the dead. And anybody who had died, boy, Jesus could just fix it for us. That's not why the gospel writers wrote these stories down. Instead, they wanted us to get a different message. Jesus wanted us to get a bigger and deeper message when he actually raised somebody from the dead. And what he was looking for us to get from that experience was not this idea that Jesus was going to run around and raise anybody he happened to come into contact with who had died from the dead. Instead, Jesus was doing, whether he was raising people from the dead or simply befriending sinners, Jesus was doing what he always did. And what Jesus was always doing in his ministry was he was giving people real hope. He was giving them hope in the face of despair. And that's sometimes hard for us to grasp the magnitude of, because so often we associate that word hope with optimism or wishful thinking. When people tell us to have hope, they're just telling us to be optimistic or to kind of think positively, but here's the problem with that kind of hope. That kind of hope is always dependent upon our own ability to keep a positive attitude, or, at worst, random chance. Real hope is different than that. So I was reading an article this month by Peter Marty in this month's issue of Living Lutheran, and he was talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor who was imprisoned in the 1930s by the Nazis for resisting the Nazi regime, and eventually he was executed in a concentration camp. And while he was in prison, he wrote quite a number of things to people, and he wrote this about hope. He said, the best place to celebrate Easter is actually in a jail cell. It's locked in a cell where one realizes the only possibility for release comes from somebody on the outside holding a key. See, here's the thing. When people are sick, there is optimism that they might get better on their own. When people are dead, they are locked in a cell from which they cannot escape on their own, and the only hope is somebody standing outside of that cell with the key. In raising people from the dead, even though it only happened a couple of times, Jesus is doing an extreme example of what he did all the time, showing people that there is somebody outside whatever cell we find ourselves locked in, with the key, who can and will use that key to release us. That's what real hope is about. Hope is about knowing that God will not leave us locked in any cell that we find ourselves in. And when Jesus did that, when he gave that kind of hope, it often happened in the context of interrupting people's lives, interrupting their grief and their despair. And when you think about it, well, when you talk about, hey, God is going to interrupt our grief and despair, we think, wow, that's a great thing. But most of the time, interruptions are just annoying. And they are experienced as annoying. If you have ever been in a funeral procession and somebody has cut you off, or somebody has blocked the funeral procession, in that moment you forget your grief and despair because you are too ticked off to remember the grief and despair, and you are just annoyed. But that is actually what Jesus does in today's gospel reading. There is absolutely no indication that Jesus had ever met this family or ever been to this town. He's walking into the town. They don't know who Jesus is. He doesn't know them. Suddenly, he literally blocks the procession, and he stops people in their tracks. And it's annoying. And they don't know that Jesus is going to do anything. They don't even know who he is. Because sometimes when we look at these interruptions and we're reading along and go, oh, wow, Jesus stopped the funeral. Now just wait, Jesus is going to do something great and wonderful. But they don't know that. They're just annoyed at this interruption. But it's in that interruption that God does something really great and literally restores life to them because of that interruption. And what Jesus was doing in that raising of somebody from the dead was reminding us that sometimes it's in the interruptions of our lives that God does His most powerful work. Sometimes it's simply in interrupting the grief and the despair that we so often get caught up in that God is working to do something new in our lives and to bring us hope and actual healing. And that also means that what God is doing, what Jesus is doing in those interruptions, is transforming us. One of the things that I think is the most difficult thing to realize when we read any of these great miracle stories, especially miracle stories about people being raised back to life, is that we tend to think that Jesus goes, finds somebody who's died, says, young man, sit up. He sits up, he talks, he gives him back to his mother. It's the exact same wording as when Elijah gives the child back to his mother. Now we think, okay, Jesus has set everything right again. Everything can go on just like it was before. It can go on just like it was before the guy had died. Everything gets back to normal. But that is never what happens. People's lives are changed. They're transformed. Not just the person being raised from the dead, everybody. Luke doesn't say everybody went, breathed a collective sigh of relief and went, okay, now we can get back to normal. He said, fear seized all of them. They were shaken up, and they glorified God. And they realized that their lives were never going to be the same. The way they thought and acted, and the way they felt about the future was going to be different because of the way they had experienced God interjecting hope in the midst of their despair. That is what Jesus was always about doing, whether he was raising people from the dead or simply befriending sinners. He was about transforming people's lives. And that is still what Jesus is about doing in our lives today. That is what we baptized Cameron into this morning. That is what we're all baptized into. A life where God is always working to bring us hope, to interrupt our cycles of grief and despair, to transform us into people who can live in that hope right now. Because in the end, Jesus did not revive people from death just to do a favor for a few select individuals. Instead, he did it to show us the extent to which we can have hope in God's love and in God's power. He did it to interrupt the grief and the despair that we so often get caught up into. And he did it to transform our lives so that we can live differently right now because of God's power and God's presence in our lives.